My name is Zara Malik, and on May 15th, 2017, I died for exactly 7 minutes after a truck crashed into my car. I was 24 years old, a former child bride who had escaped an arranged marriage and was rebuilding my life. What Jesus showed me in those 7 minutes transformed everything I believed about God, love, and my worth as a woman. If someone had told me 10 years ago that I would one day love Jesus with every fiber of my being, I would have laughed in their face or perhaps even cursed them for speaking such blasphemy. But today, as I sit here at 30 years old, I cannot stop speaking his name, cannot contain the love that overflows from a heart that was once shattered beyond repair. If you have ever felt trapped, unworthy, forgotten by God Himself, please listen closely to what I am about to share. Because I have walked in those dark valleys, and I know intimately the silence that follows desperate prayers offered to a heaven that seems closed. I was born in a small, conservative village where Islamic tradition governed every aspect of daily life, where women existed to serve and obey, where questioning religious authority was considered the gravest sin imaginable. My father, Hassan Malik, was a respected imam in our community, a man whose knowledge of the Quran was legendary and whose interpretation of Islamic law was considered absolute and unquestionable. He ruled our household with the same iron authority he wielded in the mosque, demanding perfect submission from his wife and daughters as a reflection of our devotion to Allah. When I turned 8 years old, my childhood ended with a conversation I was not allowed to participate in. My father had arranged my marriage to Rashid Al Mansouri, a wealthy merchant from a neighboring village who was 35 years old and in need of a young wife to bear him sons. The bride price had been negotiated, the religious contracts had been signed, and my fate had been sealed without anyone asking what I might want or need or dream about for my future. The day of my wedding remains burned into my memory like a brand that never fades. I remember standing in my mother's modest bedroom, draped in a heavy red dress that felt more like a burial shroud than a celebration garment. The gold jewelry that adorned my neck and wrists felt like chains, weighing me down with the gravity of what was about to happen to my young life. My mother, her own eyes red from weeping, painted my small hands with intricate henna patterns while whispering prayers that I would find favor with my new husband and bear him many sons. This is Allah's will for you, she told me as she adjusted my veil, her voice trembling with emotions she was not permitted to express. A woman's highest calling is to serve her husband and raise his children in the faith. You are blessed to be chosen for this sacred purpose. Even at 8 years old, I could sense that something was terribly wrong with this arrangement, but I had been taught never to question the wisdom of my elders or the commands of Allah as they interpreted them. The wedding ceremony itself was a blur of Arabic chants, religious rituals, and congratulations from adults who seemed oblivious to the terror in my young eyes. Rashid appeared to me like a giant, towering over my small frame with a beard that was already showing streaks of gray and hands that looked capable of crushing my fragile bones. When the Imam pronounced us husband and wife according to Islamic law, I felt something die inside my chest, some essential part of childhood innocence that would never return. But it was the wedding night that truly broke something fundamental in my spirit. Rashid led me to a room I had never seen before, decorated with flowers and candles that were supposed to represent romance and new beginnings. I was too young to fully understand what was expected of me, but old enough to feel overwhelming fear and shame as he began to remove my wedding dress. When I started to cry, he told me firmly that tears were disobedience to Allah, that a good Muslim wife submits to her husband's desires without complaint or resistance. That night, as I lay in darkness afterward, my small body aching with pain I had no words to describe, I offered my first desperate prayer to Allah. Please, I whispered into the suffocating silence. Please take me away from here. Please protect me. Please show me that you love me and haven't forgotten that I exist. The silence that greeted my prayer was deafening, more terrifying than any physical pain I had endured. It felt like proof that even God had abandoned me to my fate. The years that followed blurred together in a haze of submission, religious devotion, and crushing loneliness. As I grew from a child into a teenager, Rashid's expectations increased along with my physical development. I was expected to cook elaborate meals, maintain a spotless household, receive his friends with proper hospitality, and fulfill his conjugal demands without ever expressing my own needs or desires. Any sign of independence or self assertion was met with religious lectures about the wickedness of rebellious women who dishonor their husbands and displease Allah. Maybe you have prayed too, desperately and sincerely, for peace that never came, for escape that seemed impossible, for some sign that God cares about your suffering. Maybe you know the particular agony of hearing nothing but silence when your heart is breaking and your spirit is crying out for help. I lived in that silence for 16 years, convinced that my suffering was either punishment for some sin I could not identify or a test of faith that I was failing miserably. In my determination to please Allah and perhaps earn some relief from my circumstances, I threw myself into religious observance with the fervor of a true believer. I memorized vast portions of the Quran, staying up late into the night to perfect my recitation and understand the deeper meanings of each verse. I fasted not just during Ramadan, but throughout the year, hoping that my sacrifice would demonstrate my worthiness for divine mercy. I prayed far more than the required 5 times daily, often rising in the middle of the night to offer additional supplications for forgiveness and guidance, despite my intense religious devotion. The spiritual emptiness in my heart only seemed to grow deeper with each passing year. The Allah I worshipped felt distant and demanding, a deity who required perfect obedience but offered little comfort in return. My prayers felt like they were bouncing off the ceiling, never reaching their intended destination, never bringing the peace or assurance that Islamic teachings promise to faithful believers. When I finally found the courage to escape my marriage at the age of 22, it was not because of any divine intervention or religious revelation, but simply because the alternative was death. Rashid's violence had escalated to the point where I genuinely feared he would kill me in one of his rages. And I realized that even the shame of being a divorced woman was preferable to becoming a martyred wife. The night I fled our house with nothing but the clothes on my back and a small bag of personal belongings, I felt like I was stepping into an abyss of uncertainty, abandoning everything I had ever known for a future that might be even worse. The 2 years I spent rebuilding my life in a different city were simultaneously liberating and terrifying. For the first time since childhood, I could make decisions about my daily schedule, my meals, my friendships, my work. I found employment at a textile factory where my quick hands and attention to detail made me a valued employee. I rented a small apartment where I could come and go as I pleased, where no one monitored my behavior or criticized my choices. Yet, even in my newfound freedom, the spiritual emptiness that had haunted my married years continued to gnaw at my soul. I continued practicing Islam out of habit and cultural identity, but my prayers felt increasingly hollow. My faith, more like going through motions than experiencing genuine connection with the divine. Something essential was missing from my relationship with God, but I had no idea what that missing piece might be or where I could find it. That sense of spiritual searching, that deep longing for connection with something greater than myself, was occupying my thoughts on the morning of May 15th, 2017, as I prepared for what I assumed would be just another ordinary day at the factory. I had no idea that within hours, everything I thought I knew about God, about truth, about the meaning of life itself, would be completely transformed by an encounter that would change my eternal destiny forever. The morning of May 15th, 2017 began like countless others since I had gained my freedom from that suffocating marriage. I woke at 5:30 a.m. in my modest apartment, the call to prayer echoing faintly from the mosque 3 blocks away, a sound that had regulated my entire life, but now felt more like background noise than spiritual summons. As I performed my ritual ablutions in the tiny bathroom, washing my hands, face, and feet in the prescribed manner, I caught my reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. At 24, I had finally begun to see glimpses of the woman I might become rather than the broken girl I had been. 2 years of independence had brought color back to my cheeks and strength to my shoulders, though my eyes still carried the weight of experiences no woman should ever endure. I had been asking myself increasingly difficult questions about faith, about purpose, about whether the emptiness I felt inside would ever be filled with something meaningful and lasting. That particular Tuesday morning carried an unusual heaviness, not physical but spiritual, as if the very air around me was charged with anticipation for something I could not identify. As I dressed for work in my simple factory uniform, I found myself thinking about the conversation I had overheard the previous day between two Christian women who worked in the packaging department. They had been discussing something they called a personal relationship with Jesus, speaking about prayer as if it were an intimate conversation rather than a ritualistic duty. Their words had puzzled me because they described a connection with God that sounded nothing like my experience of Islamic worship. These women spoke of feeling loved unconditionally, of finding peace that transcended their circumstances, of knowing with certainty that they were heard and cherished by their Creator. I had dismissed their conversation as Christian delusion, but something about the joy in their voices, the confidence in their faith, had lingered in my mind like a seed planted in fertile soil. The spring rain that had been threatening all week finally began falling as I prepared to leave for work. Heavy drops that quickly transformed into a downpour that made the streets treacherous and visibility poor. Standing at my apartment window, watching the water cascade down the glass in thick streams, I offered what would be my final prayer as a Muslim. Allah, if you have any purpose for my life beyond survival, please show me. I am tired of feeling empty, tired of searching for something I cannot name. The drive to the textile factory normally took 20 minutes through the busy morning traffic, but the storm had slowed everything to a crawl. Cars crept along the flooded streets with their hazard lights blinking. Drivers hunched over their steering wheels as they strained to see through windshields that the wipers could barely keep clear. I remember feeling oddly contemplative as I navigated the familiar route, my mind wandering to questions that had been building for months about the meaning of life, the nature of God, the reason for suffering. What I did not know as I drove through that storm was that the driver of a large delivery truck several miles ahead of me had been working double shifts for 3 weeks straight, trying to earn extra money for his daughter's wedding. Exhaustion had finally overtaken him, and he had fallen asleep at the wheel while making what should have been a routine delivery to a warehouse district. His truck was barreling through the rain-soaked streets at full speed, completely out of control, heading directly toward the intersection I was approaching. The collision happened at exactly 8:47 a.m. I was stopped at a red light, listening to the rhythmic sound of rain against my car roof and thinking about whether I would have the courage to ask those Christian women more about their faith when suddenly the entire world exploded into chaos. The massive truck slammed into the passenger side of my small sedan with such force that my car spun 3 complete rotations before crashing into a concrete barrier with a sound like thunder splitting the earth. Time seemed to fracture into slow motion sequences as the accident unfolded. I remember seeing the truck's grille filling my passenger window, impossibly large and terrifying, and knowing with crystal clarity that I was about to die. There was no time for fear, no opportunity to pray or cry out for help. Just the strange acceptance that comes when you realize your earthly life is ending, whether you are ready or not. The sound was indescribable, a cacophony of crushing metal, shattering glass, and screaming brakes that seemed to go on forever. My small car crumpled like an aluminum can under the truck's weight, the roof collapsing inward and the engine block driving back toward the passenger compartment. I felt rather than heard my ribs breaking, felt the warm wetness of blood flowing from somewhere on my head, felt the strange sensation of my life force beginning to ebb away like water draining from a broken vessel. In those final moments of consciousness, as emergency sirens wailed in the distance and people shouted my name from somewhere far away, I experienced something I had never felt before in all my years of Islamic faith. Instead of terror at facing divine judgment, instead of panic about whether I had performed enough good deeds to earn paradise, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace settling over me like a warm blanket. Then everything went dark, and Zara Malik, as the world had known her, ceased to exist. But that darkness lasted only moments before it was replaced by something extraordinary. I found myself rising above the twisted wreckage of my car, watching with detached curiosity as paramedics rushed to the scene and began their desperate attempts to extract my broken body from the metal tomb it had become. From my vantage point somewhere near the power lines overhead, I could see my own face, pale and bloodied, my eyes closed and my body unnaturally still among the collapsed metal and shattered glass. The scene below looked like something from a movie rather than my actual life. Emergency workers shouted instructions to each other as they worked with hydraulic tools to pry apart the wreckage, their movements urgent, yet somehow futile. I could see the truck driver standing nearby, his face white with shock, as he realized what his momentary lapse had caused. Bystanders had gathered despite the continuing rain, some recording the scene with their phones, others simply staring in horror at the devastation. What struck me most powerfully was the complete absence of pain or fear that I felt while observing my own death, instead of the agony that should have accompanied such massive physical trauma. I experienced a lightness and freedom I had never known during my 24 years of earthly existence. It was as if a tremendous weight I had carried my entire life without realizing it had suddenly been lifted from my shoulders. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to watch your own life end? To observe the frantic efforts of strangers trying to save a body you no longer inhabit? There is something both heartbreaking and strangely beautiful about witnessing the preciousness of human life from that eternal perspective, seeing how desperately people fight to preserve something that the soul has already outgrown. As I watched the paramedics finally extract my lifeless form from the wreckage and begin CPR compressions that made my body jerk like a broken puppet, I became aware that I was not alone in this space between life and death. A presence was drawing near, something so radiant and loving that every fiber of my being was attracted to it like a flower turning toward the sun. The rain soaked accident scene began to fade as I felt myself being gently pulled toward a light that was not visible to earthly eyes, but was more real than anything I had ever experienced. That light was calling me by name, speaking words of love in a voice I had never heard but somehow recognized as the sound I had been longing to hear my entire life. As I moved toward that radiant presence, leaving behind the broken shell of my former existence, I had no idea that I was about to meet the one person who would finally fill the emptiness that had haunted me since childhood, the one truth that would make sense of all the suffering and searching that had defined my journey thus far. The transition from observing my broken body at the accident scene to entering what I can only describe as the realm of eternal light happened without warning or conscious effort on my part. One moment I was floating above the wreckage, watching paramedics work frantically to restart my heart, and the next I was being drawn by an irresistible force toward a radiance that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of reality itself. This was not the harsh glare of earthly illumination, but something infinitely more beautiful, a light that carried within it the essence of perfect love, absolute truth, and eternal peace. As I moved toward this divine radiance, the rain soaked streets of my city faded away completely, replaced by a dimension that existed beyond the physical laws I had always known. The light ahead of me pulsed with life, with personality, with an intelligence that was both cosmic in scope and intimately personal. Every step I took toward this presence filled me with increasing wonder and anticipation, though I had no clear understanding of what awaited me there. The figure that emerged from the brilliant light took form gradually, like an image developing on photographic paper in a dark room. As he became visible, I experienced a shock of recognition that defied everything I had been taught about the afterlife, about divine judgment, about the nature of God Himself. This was not Allah as I had imagined Him through 24 years of Islamic faith and worship. This was Jesus Christ, the figure my religious education had taught me to dismiss as merely a prophet whose message had been corrupted by his followers. He appeared before me, clothed in garments of pure white that seemed to be woven from light itself. his face radiant with an authority and majesty that made me understand immediately that I was in the presence of divinity. His features were those of a Middle Eastern man, olive skinned with dark hair, and eyes that held depths of compassion I had never encountered in any human being. There was something familiar about him, as if I had been searching for his face my entire life without realizing it. What overwhelmed me most completely was the love that emanated from his very being. This was not the conditional affection I had known from humans, dependent on good behavior and proper performance, but something utterly unconditional and transformative. His love was like standing in warm sunlight after a lifetime of living in shadow, like drinking pure water after years of thirst, like coming home to a place I had never been but always belonged. My first coherent thought upon recognizing him was one of complete confusion and growing panic. This cannot be right, I whispered, my voice somehow audible in this dimension beyond physical sound. He is not supposed to be here. I am Muslim. I followed the law of Allah. I prayed 5 times daily and tried to be pure. Everything I had been taught about the afterlife suggested that I should be meeting Allah or perhaps the angel of death, not this Jesus whom my Islamic education had relegated to the status of a minor prophet. But Jesus looked at me with eyes that held infinite understanding and spoke my name with such tenderness that every defense I had ever built around my heart began to crumble. Zara, he said, and his voice carried the music of creation itself. You were never meant to suffer in fear. You were meant to know my love. The way he pronounced my name made it sound like the most beautiful word ever spoken, filled with meaning and purpose I had never imagined it could possess. I tried to maintain my religious convictions even in his presence, clinging to the Islamic framework that had defined my understanding of God throughout my life. But Lord, I was Muslim, I protested, my voice trembling with confusion. I followed the law as it was given to me. I tried to be pure and obedient and worthy of paradise. How can you be here when I was taught that you were only a prophet, not the Son of God? Jesus smiled with infinite patience and compassion, the kind of understanding that parents show to children who are struggling to comprehend concepts beyond their current knowledge. My precious daughter, he said, you were searching for me all along. Every prayer you offered in sincerity, every tear you shed in seeking truth, every moment you cried out for love and acceptance, I saw it all. I heard every word, felt every pain, knew every longing of your heart. As he spoke these words, something began happening that defied description. Scenes from my life started playing out around us like three-dimensional movies, but viewed from his perspective rather than mine. I saw myself as an 8-year-old child on my wedding night, terrified and alone in that darkened room. But now I could perceive that Jesus had been there with me, weeping over my pain, holding me in spiritual arms even when I felt completely abandoned. I watched my teenage years unfold again. Those long nights when I would lie awake after Rashid had hurt me, praying desperately to Allah for comfort that never seemed to come. But now I could see that Jesus had been present in every moment that his heart had broken with mine. That the unexplained comfort I sometimes felt was actually his divine presence, offering what solace he could within the framework of my incomplete understanding. The revelation that overwhelmed me was recognizing that every sincere prayer I had ever offered, regardless of the religious language I had used, had reached the ears of this loving God who stood before me. When I had cried out to Allah for protection, it was Jesus who had heard. When I had begged for strength to endure another day, it was His strength that had sustained me. When I had pleaded for someone to love me unconditionally, His love had been the answer I was seeking all along. I was with you in every moment of pain, He explained as we watched the scenes of my childhood and young marriage play out with heartbreaking clarity, even when you did not know my name. Every time you felt a mysterious comfort in your darkest hours, that was me. Every time you found strength you did not know you possessed, that came from me. Every moment you sensed that you were loved despite your circumstances, you were experiencing my love for you. The most profound revelation came when He showed me that my religious devotion, despite being misdirected, had been precious to Him because it represented the sincere seeking of my heart. He had seen past the Islamic framework to the genuine desire for God that motivated my prayers and fasting and study of Scripture. My devotion had not been wasted or meaningless, but rather, like letters addressed to the right person but sent to the wrong address, they had still reached their intended recipient. Your heart always belonged to me, Jesus continued, His voice filled with infinite tenderness, even when your mind was confused about my identity. The love you were seeking through religious performance has always been freely available through relationship with me. You never needed to earn what I was longing to give you as a gift. Have you ever realized that everything you thought you knew about God was only a partial glimpse of His true nature? Have you discovered that the divine love you have been seeking through religious effort has been offered as a free gift all along? That was the earth-shattering reality that washed over me as I stood in the presence of Jesus Christ, understanding for the first time that the God I had spent my life trying to please through perfect Islamic observance was actually calling me into an intimate relationship I had never dared to imagine was possible. The weight of this revelation was almost too much to bear. 24 years of religious striving, of trying to earn divine approval through correct behavior and perfect submission, dissolved in an instant when I encountered the unconditional love that had been waiting for me all along. This was not the distant, demanding deity I had worshipped through fear and duty, but a personal God who knew every detail of my story and loved me not in spite of my brokenness, but through it and beyond it. As these truths penetrated my consciousness, I felt a transformation beginning at the very core of my being, a fundamental shift from religion to relationship, from performance to grace, from fear to love. The empty place in my heart that had ached for so many years was finally being filled by the very presence of the one who had created it in the first place. As the initial shock of recognizing Jesus began to settle into my consciousness, He continued to reveal truths that completely transformed my understanding of God's nature, human suffering, and the purpose behind every painful experience I had endured. What He showed me next challenged everything I thought I knew about divine justice, religious systems, and the heart of the Creator toward His children who had been wounded by those claiming to act in His name. Let me show you something that will help you understand, Jesus said as the space around us began to shimmer and change. Suddenly, I was witnessing scenes I had never imagined, moments throughout history when religious systems had been used to oppress rather than liberate, to control rather than heal, to inflict pain rather than offer comfort. I saw countless women throughout the centuries who had suffered under religious laws that claimed divine authority but reflected human cruelty and control. I witnessed young girls in various cultures being subjected to forced marriages, genital mutilation, honor killings, and other forms of violence, all justified by religious interpretations that claimed to represent God's will. But what overwhelmed me was seeing Jesus present in every single moment of their suffering, his heart breaking alongside theirs, his love surrounding them even when they had no knowledge of his existence or care. These atrocities were never my design, he said, his voice carrying infinite grief over the ways his name and authority had been misused throughout human history. When I created marriage, I intended it to be a picture of divine love, a partnership between equals who choose each other freely. What was done to you as a child, what was done to countless others in my name, breaks my heart in ways you cannot comprehend. The revelation that my forced marriage and childhood sexual abuse had grieved the heart of God rather than being ordained by Him was almost too overwhelming to process. For 16 years, I had assumed that my suffering was either divine punishment for some unknown sin or a test of faith that I needed to endure with patient submission, learning that God Himself had wept over my pain, that He had never intended for children to be treated as property or for women to live in fear and submission, shattered the theological framework that had defined my understanding of divine will. Jesus then showed me visions of heaven that took my breath away, if indeed I still possessed breath in that eternal realm. I saw a place of perfect peace where love reigned supreme, where fear was unknown, where every tear had been wiped away and every wound had been healed. The beauty was beyond anything earthly language could describe, but what struck me most powerfully was the complete absence of the shame, anxiety, and performance pressure that had characterized my religious experience on earth. In heaven, worship was not duty but joy, not obligation but celebration. I saw people from every nation and culture and religious background united not by shared theology, but by shared experience of divine love. There were former Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, and people who had never heard any religious teaching at all, but they were all there because they had encountered and accepted the love of Jesus either in life or at the moment of death. My love is not limited by human religious categories, Jesus explained as I marveled at this diverse gathering of souls. What matters is not the religious label people carried on earth, but whether they opened their hearts to receive the love I offered them. Many who called themselves Christians never knew me personally, while many who followed other faiths were actually responding to my call without realizing it. The contrast between this heavenly reality and the religious oppression I had experienced was stark and liberating. Here were women who had been told they were inferior on earth, now reigning as spiritual royalty. Here were children who had been abused in the name of religion, now dancing with perfect freedom and joy. Here were people who had been condemned by religious authorities, now celebrated as beloved children of the Most High God. But then Jesus showed me something that filled me with profound sorrow. I witnessed souls in a place of darkness, not because God had condemned them there, but because they had consistently rejected His love and chosen instead to remain in their pride, hatred, and self-centeredness. What broke my heart was seeing that many of these souls had been religious leaders on earth who had used faith as a tool for control rather than an avenue for love. The religious system that oppressed you, Jesus said gently, was not representing my heart. Many who claim to speak for me have never actually listened to my voice or experienced my love. They preach law without grace, judgment without mercy, fear without hope. This is why I must send you back, my daughter. People need to hear what real divine love sounds like. The commission he was giving me began to crystallize as he showed me visions of other Muslim women around the world who were trapped in situations similar to what I had experienced. I saw young girls being sold into marriage, women being beaten for asserting basic human rights, mothers being forced to watch their daughters suffer the same cycle of abuse they had endured. But I also saw the hunger in their hearts for a love that would never fail them, a hope that could not be destroyed by human cruelty. Your testimony will reach places where traditional missionaries could never go, Jesus revealed, showing me scenes of underground gatherings where women would share my story in whispered conversations. Muslim women who would never listen to a Western Christian will hear your words with open hearts because you have walked in their shoes, understood their pain, lived in their world of religious oppression and cultural expectations. I watched visions of future conversations I would have with women in refugee camps, in secret women's meetings, and online forums where women gathered to share their struggles and questions. I saw hearts opening to the possibility that God's love might be different from what they had been taught. That divine acceptance might not depend on perfect religious performance, that healing was possible from the deepest wounds of religious trauma. Look inside your own heart right now, friend. Do you find fear when you think about God, or do you find love? Do you approach the divine with anxiety about your performance, or with confidence in his acceptance? The revelation Jesus was showing me was that the creator of the universe desires relationship rather than religion, intimacy rather than mere obedience, love rather than fearful submission. Every woman who has been told that her worth depends on her submission to male authority needs to hear this truth. Jesus continued, his voice filled with passionate conviction. Every person who has been wounded by religion needs to know that those wounds were never my intention, that healing is possible, that love without conditions is their birthright as my children. The transformation that was taking place within my spirit was not just intellectual understanding, but fundamental change at the core of my identity. The shame that had defined me since childhood was being replaced by an unshakable sense of my value as God's beloved daughter. The fear that had motivated my religious practices was dissolving in the presence of perfect love. The emptiness that had ached within me for 24 years was being filled by the very presence of the one who had created that longing in the first place. This is why you suffered, Jesus said, though his words carried no callousness, only infinite compassion and purpose, not because I wanted you to experience pain, but because the enemy of souls, uses religious systems to wound my children and keep them from knowing my love. Your suffering will now become the foundation for helping others find the healing you are experiencing. The weight of this calling was both humbling and terrifying. To return to a world where sharing this testimony could cost me my life where my family and community would view me as an apostate deserving of death, where I would face rejection and persecution for the rest of my earthly existence. Yet the love I was experiencing made any sacrifice seem insignificant compared to the privilege of introducing other wounded souls to this same transformative encounter with divine acceptance. After what felt like hours but could have been moments or centuries in that timeless realm of perfect love, Jesus turned to me with an expression that carried both infinite compassion and divine authority. The radiance surrounding him seemed to intensify as he prepared to speak words that would forever alter the trajectory of my existence, both in the eternal dimension where we stood and in the broken world I had left behind. "Zara, my beloved daughter," he said, his voice carrying the weight of cosmic purpose, "your time in this realm has been precious to both of us. But your mission on earth is far from complete." As these words penetrated my consciousness, I felt a mixture of confusion and growing resistance. How could my time in this place of perfect peace and unconditional love be anything but permanent? The thought of leaving his presence felt like being asked to abandon paradise for exile. "Lord," I responded, my spiritual voice trembling with emotion, "how can you ask me to return to that world of pain and rejection? Here with you, everything makes perfect sense. There, I will face hatred from my family, persecution from my community, and constant danger from those who will view my testimony as blasphemy, worthy of death." The contrast between the eternal love I was experiencing and the earthly suffering that awaited my return seemed impossibly cruel. Jesus reached out and touched what would have been my forehead if I had possessed physical form. The contact sent waves of supernatural strength and courage through every fiber of my being, along with a deeper understanding of what true love requires. "My precious child," he said with infinite gentleness, "saying here would indeed be easier for you, but love never chooses the easy path. Love always seeks to serve others rather than serve itself." As he spoke these words, our surroundings shifted dramatically, and I found myself looking down at the scene of my car accident, where emergency workers were still fighting desperately to save my life. 7 minutes had passed since my heart had stopped beating, 7 minutes during which my spirit had journeyed into eternity and encountered the living God. The paramedics were performing their final attempt at resuscitation, their faces grim with the knowledge that hope was nearly gone. "Watch closely," Jesus instructed, and my spiritual vision sharpened to perceive details that revealed the spiritual battle taking place around my broken body. I could see dark entities hovering near the accident scene, their presence radiating malice and satisfaction at what they believed was another victory over a seeking soul. They whispered lies about my worthlessness, about the futility of faith, about the emptiness that awaited those who died without hope. But I could also see angels of light surrounding the emergency workers, guiding their hands, sustaining their strength, filling them with determination to continue their efforts beyond normal medical protocols. These heavenly beings were engaged in warfare I had never imagined, fighting for my life, not just physically but spiritually, understanding that my testimony would impact countless other souls if I were allowed to return. The enemy intended to use your death to spread despair and convince other suffering women that there is no hope beyond their circumstances, Jesus explained, but I will use your resurrection to plant seeds of faith in the darkest places to demonstrate that my love is stronger than any religious system designed to oppress and control. He then showed me visions of the future that awaited if I chose to accept his commission to return to life. I watched myself recovering in a hospital bed, weak in body but strong in spirit, immediately beginning to share my testimony with nurses, doctors, and other patients. I saw the initial shock and disbelief on their faces transform into wonder as they witnessed the peace and joy radiating from a woman who should have been traumatized by her near death experience. The scenes expanded to show me the ministry that would emerge from this miraculous resurrection. I witnessed myself speaking to groups of refugee women in camps across the Middle East, sharing not just the story of my death and return, but the deeper truth about God's love that transcended religious boundaries. I watched faces light up with hope as women who had been crushed by religious oppression heard for the first time that their worth was not dependent on their submission to human authority. Your testimony will reach places where traditional evangelists could never penetrate, Jesus revealed, showing me underground networks of Muslim women who would secretly share my story through social media, text messages, and whispered conversations. They will listen to you because you speak their language, understand their culture, know their pain from personal experience. I saw myself working with organizations dedicated to helping victims of forced marriage and religious abuse, using my story as a bridge to introduce traumatized women to the healing love I had discovered. I watched former Muslim women who had found Jesus through my testimony becoming powerful advocates for others still trapped in oppressive religious systems, but perhaps the most compelling vision was seeing the spiritual impact of my return on the very people who would initially reject my testimony. I witnessed my father, the strict imam who had arranged my childhood marriage, eventually encountering Jesus himself after years of wrestling with questions planted by my transformed life. I saw former Islamic extremists whose hearts were softened by observing the genuine love and forgiveness I demonstrated toward those who persecuted me for my faith. The ripple effects of your obedience will extend far beyond what you can see or imagine, Jesus continued, his voice filled with divine anticipation. Every soul that finds freedom through your testimony will become a light to others. Every woman who discovers her worth through your story will help rescue others from the same bondage you escaped. The resistance I felt to leaving his presence was overwhelming, but his next words addressed the deepest fear in my heart. You will not return alone, my daughter. My presence will go with you every step of the way. When you face rejection from your family, I will be your comfort. When you encounter persecution for my name, I will be your strength. When you feel isolated and alone in your testimony, remember this moment and know that you carry my love within you. He touched my forehead one final time, and I felt his spirit enter into the very core of my being in a way that I knew would remain with me for the rest of my earthly existence. You are mine now, Zara, he declared with absolute authority. Live not for human approval, but for my glory. Share not your own wisdom, but my truth. Love not with human affection, but with my divine love that transforms everything it touches. The final vision he showed me before my return was of myself many years in the future. An older woman surrounded by dozens of other women whose lives had been transformed through my testimony. I saw former Muslims, former victims of religious abuse, former prisoners of cultural oppression, all gathered together in worship of the Jesus who had set them free. Their faces radiated the same peace and joy I was experiencing in that eternal moment. This is why you must return, Jesus said with finality that brooked no argument, not just for your own sake, but for the sake of every woman still trapped in the darkness you have escaped. Your resurrection will be proof to a watching world that my love is stronger than death, that my truth transcends religious systems, that my grace can reach into the deepest places of human suffering and bring healing. As he spoke these final words of commissioning, I felt the irresistible pull beginning to draw me back toward the physical realm. The perfect light that had surrounded us began to fade, not because it was disappearing, but because I was being compressed back into the limitations of flesh and blood. Yet, even as I descended through dimensions back toward my broken body, I carried with me the absolute certainty that I would never again be alone, never again be without purpose, never again doubt that I was loved beyond measure by the Creator of the universe. The transition from eternal glory to earthly pain was about to begin. But I face it now with courage, born of divine love and purpose that would sustain me through whatever persecution and rejection awaited my return to the land of the living. The violent compression of my expanded consciousness back into the confines of my broken physical body was like trying to force an ocean into a teacup. Every truth that had been revealed, every moment of perfect love I had experienced, every vision of divine purpose had to somehow squeeze into the limited capacity of a human brain that had been deprived of oxygen for 7 crucial minutes. The sensation was crushing, disorienting, and overwhelmingly painful as my spirit reconnected with flesh that had been traumatized beyond normal survival. The first sensation that registered was pure agony. Pain exploded through every nerve ending in my body as my heart suddenly lurched back to life. My lungs convulsed with desperate hunger for air, and my consciousness slammed back into a physical form that had been broken in ways that should have been irreparable. I gasped with such violence that my entire body arched off the emergency room table, a sound escaping my throat that was part scream, part sob, part victory cry of resurrection. My eyes flew open to see the shocked faces of medical personnel staring down at me in complete amazement. Dr. Ahmed Hassan, the emergency physician who had been attempting my resuscitation, stepped backward with an expression of wonder and disbelief. According to the monitors that had been tracking my vital signs, I had been clinically dead for exactly 7 minutes, with no heartbeat, no brain activity, and no respiratory function. By every medical standard he knew, I should have been brain dead, even if my heart could somehow be restarted. Yet here I was, not only alive but completely lucid, my cognitive functions apparently intact despite the prolonged absence of oxygen to my brain. My vital signs, which should have been weak and irregular after such massive trauma, were stronger and more stable than they had any right to be. The internal injuries that should have required immediate surgery had somehow stabilized on their own, as if my body had been supernaturally healed during those 7 minutes when my spirit dwelt in eternity. The first coherent word that escaped my lips was Jesus, spoken with such clarity and conviction that it sent shock waves through the Muslim medical staff who had been working to save my life. In our culture, the name of Jesus was rarely spoken except in the context of historical discussions or interfaith dialogue. certainly never as a declaration of personal faith or divine encounter. The nurses exchanged confused glances while Dr. Hassan leaned closer to assess whether my apparent cognition was real or merely the result of oxygen deprived hallucinations. "What did you say?" he asked gently, his voice carrying professional concern mixed with genuine curiosity. When I repeated the name of Jesus, this time adding that I had seen him, spoken with him, received his love and commission, the atmosphere in the emergency room shifted dramatically. Some of the staff stepped back in alarm, while others moved closer with fascination, recognizing that they were witnessing something beyond their medical training and cultural experience. The Christian nurses who had been assisting with my care fell to their knees beside my bed, tears streaming down their faces as they recognized the miraculous nature of what had occurred. Sarah Mitchell, a British evangelical who had been working in our hospital for 2 years, later told me that she and her colleagues had been praying fervently for my resurrection during those 7 minutes, asking God to demonstrate his power and love in a way that would impact our entire community. But my family's reaction when they arrived at the hospital was far more complicated and painful than the medical staff's professional amazement. My parents, Hassan and Fatima Malik, had been contacted immediately after my accident and had rushed to the hospital expecting to claim my body for Islamic burial rites. Instead, they found me alive, alert, and speaking about an encounter with Jesus Christ that challenged everything they believed about faith, death, and divine truth. My father, whose authority as an imam in our community depended on maintaining strict Islamic orthodoxy, was visibly shaken as I described my experience in the presence of Jesus. His hands trembled as I shared how the figure he had taught me to regard as merely a prophet had revealed himself as the living God who loved me unconditionally. The theological crisis this created for him was evident in his struggle between relief at my survival and horror at my apparent apostasy. "You are confused, my daughter," he insisted, his voice carrying a mixture of desperation and authority. "The trauma of your accident has damaged your mind. You are speaking blasphemy that could bring shame and danger upon our entire family. You must recant these words and return to proper Islamic faith before others hear of this madness." But even as he spoke these words of denial, I could see in his eyes that he recognized the fundamental transformation that had occurred within me. My mother wept openly as she held my hand, torn between joy at my miraculous survival and anguish over what she perceived as my spiritual destruction. "Please, Zara," she begged, "think of what you are saying. Think of your reputation, your family's standing in the community, your future prospects for marriage and acceptance. No Muslim man will ever take you as a wife if you persist in this Christian foolishness." The irony of her words was not lost on me, given that my previous experience with Islamic marriage had been traumatic abuse sanctioned by religious authority. But I understood that her fears were genuine, rooted in a cultural and religious framework that viewed conversion from Islam as the ultimate betrayal, punishable by social ostracism, family rejection, and in some cases death at the hands of honor-preserving relatives. For 3 weeks following my resurrection, I lived in a state of incredible tension, caught between the eternal truth I had experienced and the earthly relationships that had defined my entire identity. My extended family took turns visiting my hospital room, each trying to convince me that my visions of Jesus had been hallucinations. that my apparent healing was simply good medical care, that my obligation as a dutiful Muslim daughter required me to abandon this dangerous testimony. The pressure was intense and unrelenting, coming not just from family members, but from Islamic religious leaders in our community who saw my story as a threat to their authority and influence. They offered various explanations for my experience, ranging from demonic deception to brain damage to attention seeking delusion, but none of their alternative theories could account for the dramatic change in my personality, the supernatural peace that surrounded me, or the obvious authenticity of my encounter with divine love. Maybe you feel trapped in a life that is not your choice, bound by family expectations, cultural traditions, or religious systems that offer duty instead of love, fear instead of peace, performance instead of acceptance. Maybe you have wondered if God has forgotten you, if your prayers reach only the ceiling, if your suffering has any purpose beyond endurance. I want you to know with absolute certainty that the same Jesus who met me beyond the veil of death is present with you right now, calling your name with the same tenderness he showed me. The breaking point in my family crisis came when I realized that my compromise and silence were actually preventing the very people I loved most from encountering the truth that had set me free. During a particularly intense confrontation with my father about my refusal to recant my testimony, I saw the same spiritual darkness in his eyes that I had witnessed in my abusive first husband. Religious pride had replaced genuine seeking. Theological control had overcome authentic love for God, and the very faith that was supposed to bring him closer to the divine was actually separating him from divine truth. The Christian community that eventually helped me navigate this transition did so with remarkable wisdom and compassion. Rather than encouraging me to immediately break with my family and culture, they helped me understand that my transformation would be a long-term testimony that might plant seeds of questions in hearts that were not yet ready to hear direct challenges to their beliefs. They provided safe housing when my family's pressure became dangerous, but they also encouraged me to maintain loving relationships wherever possible. The ministry that emerged from my near death experience exceeded even the visions Jesus had shown me in that eternal realm. Within months of my recovery, I was sharing my testimony with refugee women, victims of domestic violence, and others who had been wounded by religious systems that claimed divine authority for human oppression. The authenticity of my transformation, combined with my deep understanding of Islamic culture and theology, opened doors for conversations that would have been impossible for traditional missionaries. My name is Zara Malik. I was 8 when they told me that love was obedience to male authority, but I was 24 when I learned that real love has a name, and his name is Jesus. I lost everything earthly the moment I chose to follow him openly, but I gained eternal treasure that no one can ever steal. Every woman who feels trapped by religious tradition, cultural expectation, or family pressure know this. The same Jesus who met me in death wants to meet you in life, right now, right where you are. You don't have to die to encounter his love, but you do have to be willing to let that love transform you completely, regardless of what it might cost in terms of human approval or cultural acceptance. I died once, but that is when I truly began to live. The invitation he extends to you is the same one he gave to me. Come and discover what love really looks like when it has no conditions, no limits, and no end.